Today is the final day of the International AIDS Conference in Vienna, where scientists and researchers from around the world have been focusing on how to fight and cure the disease. Now, at the same time, there are some people focused on challenging the very conventional wisdom that surrounds AIDS. Joining me now is one of them, so we can find out why. Radio host Robert Scott Bell joins us now from Miami, Florida. Now, Mr. Bell, what do you argue is the truth about HIV and AIDS that you say is missing from the conference they're having right now in Vienna?
Well, I think they're overlooking the fact that we've got toxicological impact on immune function and deficiencies, nutritional and otherwise.
Wow. Wait, hold on. What does that mean, though, just to a normal person? That's,
Sure.
Sounds like a foreign language.
Yeah, understand that they're focused on a virological or a pathogenic cause of this immune deficiency disorder or syndrome called AIDS. And as a homeopath, as someone that's looked into this since the early years, particularly when Professor Peter Duesberg first wrote and published his articles about the implication of drug use, pharmaceutical drug use and illicit street drug use that occurred in the early years of the syndrome, even before it was given the name, that they did discount at a certain point that those causes that they initially acknowledged were actually causing some serious immune dysfunction and even immune collapse.
So you're arguing that drugs are the problem here that are contributing to this crisis, but you yourself are a homeopath, so don't you have something to gain by saying drugs are the problem?
Oh boy, wouldn't that be nice? No, I don't see much chance of gaining off of this. I think what I'm looking to do is save people from, let's say, overdosing on substances that there is no deficiency of in the body. And so much of the Western pharmaceutical paradigm looks to the body as if it were deficient of synthetic nutrients patented by big pharmaceutical companies and approved by federal regulatory agencies with millions of dollars, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars of conflicts of interest.
So what are you saying that people should do that are diagnosed with HIV?
Well, I don't look at them as any different than people that are diagnosed without HIV, if that were the case. The point is, it's a red herring to me. If there is immune dysfunction, I want to know why the immune dysfunction is there, and most of the time I see due to toxicological assaults, that is, excess use of pharmaceutical drugs, antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals, as well as pesticide exposure, other additives, preservatives, colorings, flavorings. These things are known destroyers of enzymes, life-giving or life-sustaining substances in the body. So I simply want to replenish the nutrients that have been depleted, that have basically been depleted by these exposures from an environmental perspective, and then give the body what it needs, take out that which it doesn't, and I see people recovering.
Okay, well, hold on really quickly. Let's back out, because if what you're saying is the case, then what has caused 576,000 people that this Center for Disease Control says have been killed in the United States from AIDS since the epidemic started, 18,000 per year? How did they all die?
Sir Lawrence, certainly in the early years, we know that the treatment for AIDS itself, which was the highly toxic antiretroviral drug, AZT, was primarily responsible, now acknowledged, for most of the deaths that occurred in the early years. And so my argument is not against the existence of immune collapse or immune disorders or immune syndromes that are very serious. My argument is that we're looking at something that is not a virological event as a primary cause, but as secondary or tertiary, if that at all. What we need to do is look at other toxic assaults from the environment, whether it be food, water, air, or drugs. And this is a paradigm that goes all the way back to Antoine Béchamp in the early years of Louis Pasteur. It's a paradigm clash. And they look at everything as if it's a drug deficiency rather than a nutrient deficiency.
Well, what about people that are maybe on your same boat, who have HIV and are really concerned with building up their immune system and doing everything right, and the virus doesn't go away? What do you say then?
Well, what is this virus and how do they test for it? I mean, if you've read the inserts to the so-called HIV test, they don't confirm the presence or absence of HIV. They cannot be used to confirm or deny the diagnosis of AIDS. So this is right from their own insert. So what are we actually doing here when we say somebody has HIV? This is a cross-reactive, non-specific antibody test.
Now, in addition, you are a radio host, and you're talking about the specifics of the HIV test. You're talking about the immune system and these very scientific things. You're a homeopath, but why should anyone believe you coming from that position over scientists who have been studying this for decades?
Sure. Well, the conflicts of interest in the so-called scientific realm have turned science into religion. It's more like scientism. People are worshiping at the feet of these doctors or scientists, not ever reviewing the actual base papers from where this started, and then disavowing themselves of any clinical acknowledgement of people getting well or being well 25 years after being so-called identified as having or carrying HIV or antibodies to HIV, which I would argue is pretty much nonspecific. They don't know what they're really reacting to because there are so many false positives to what we really don't know. So when you look at the scientific journals, the original papers, you don't have to believe me. I don't ask my audience to believe me. I want them to go look for it themselves. I've interviewed many of these doctors and scientists over many years now, over a decade, and I'm certainly convinced that they don't have the science on their side. In fact, they would argue differently, I realize that, but mostly it falls into ad hominem attacks.
Okay, I want to ask you real quickly because we're almost out of time, but I want to know, are you saying that there are people that have HIV and that take great care of themselves and then don't have HIV anymore? And if you don't believe in the test, then how can you even prove that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the point of what are they testing positive to, what is there, what isn't there. But certainly I know many people, and I've appeared and I have many radio shows I've done. There are videos and YouTubes that I've interviewed some families, young children that were diagnosed at the early years of age that 20 years later are perfectly fine and healthy, so they exist. These are the living proof that the mainstream media, as we call it, do not like to cover because there's too much pharmaceutical intervention or corruption or, let's say, conflicts of interest.
Are you saying that the mainstream media bends to the power of the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, you asked about the benefits. The conflicts of interest are very real, whether they be voting for or against a drug. That we see this every day, whether it be Avandia here in the United States or Vioxx and what has happened. But certainly with these highly toxic chemotherapeutic agents for AIDS, billions of dollars have been made. Billions, not millions, billions. So we have to ask very seriously, how are these conflicts of interest impacting science, the freedom of science to ask these questions and to investigate them? You don't just shut down questioning in science because you don't like the question, and that is certainly what has happened since the era of AIDS. It used to be when you had an antibody, you were going to live. That was a good thing. In the era of AIDS, that was turned up on its head. Suddenly an antibody meant you were going to die. And then they spend billions of dollars to identify a vaccine that can what? Stimulate an antibody to HIV? How will that suddenly make you live?
Well, we're gonna leave it with that question. I want to thank you for your insight into the other side of AIDS that we don't typically hear about in terms of this discussion.